Yeah, it is my pleasure to introduce Marie Zettlemoyer, who is awesome. That is the intro that I'm going to give her, and she's going to tell you all about her background and why she is awesome. And I'm really looking forward to this. So everyone, welcome Marie.
Yeah. Thanks. This is my actual size. Oh. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. While I figure out how to do this, this is not my presentation. Just a big white piece. How many people have had coffee? This will, good. Thank you. Thank you for that community service this morning. I appreciate it. Help me out. Do you want to save changes to this? Yes, no? So just for a show of hands, how many folks here have been in the security industry for less than 3 years? Okay, 5 years, 10, your whole lives. All right, so we got Tyler in the back. All right, so what I'm going to do today is go through the 2018 threat landscape, give you some ideas on how to communicate threats, quantify them. We're going to go through threat actors, motivations, kind of what we're combating today. And I really want you to walk away with some good pieces of data that can arm you in telling your story, evangelizing security to your peers, your counterparts, the lines of businesses that you work for, to help kind of move this mission forward. And with that, let's get going. So this is me, 19 years of tackling the tough stuff. So I did promise Tyler I'd spend just a little bit on my background for those of you that are just getting into the industry or perhaps looking to shift gears within the industry. So when I started out in business. So the first decade of my career, all business, accounting, finance, marketing, everything that you can think of. So I speak every business language and I root everything in analytics. About 9 years ago, I fell in love with security and have been in this context ever since. So I didn't come up through what some people would call traditional ranks. I came from the business side, went into security, and that's what makes me a great translator of things. So 17 clients and organizations across 8 different industries. I've seen a lot of stuff. I've learned to stop saying that there isn't a lot that surprises me because then life finds a way. But it does give me a good basis to kind of weave in strategies and dissect hard problems. I have 2 degrees from U of M, go blue. Is anybody here from Ohio State, by the way? No, thank God. Okay, just kidding. I'm also on the board of directors for SSH Communication Strategy, which is a publicly held company in Finland, and I'm an advisor to many startups. Here are some of the logos that I've worked for over the years. As you can see, I've been in federal law enforcement, I've been in automotive, fintech, energy, utilities, you name it. So lots of interesting things. I've seen a lot of wonderful things. I've seen a lot of scary things. But you know, from all of that, I think we get context to just move forward. So I encourage you to, even if you have been in one industry for a long time, get curious about other industries, see where patterns lie, see where you can make connections to kind of learn from each other, because we're more similar than we are different. There's also a couple MMA fights in there. You don't get these shoulders from playing piano. So other fun things that you can ask me about later. With that. All right, so I promised you some data points. As you know, I sit at the intersection of business, analytics, and security. And I find that no matter where you are at in your career, whether in whatever field that you're in, particularly in security, whether you are in the SOC, or you're in Intel, or you're a red teamer, whatever, data is going to help you tell your story and translate across groups. So I really encourage you to be able to arm yourself with some of these things. So looking at the numbers, how many of you in your organizations focus on breaches versus compromises of any type? So I hear this a lot, especially in finance. it used to be that people will talk only about a data breach, and some of these numbers are particularly around data breaches. That's not the same as a compromise. A data breach is a type of compromise, okay? So I want you just to kind of grok the difference there. So a breach, of course, is exfiltration of data. A compromise could be destruction or what have you. And we have different levels in the audience today, so I'm just going to break it down a little bit. So what's happening? We're discovering more of our own breaches, which is good. Previously, we've had a problem of more of the breaches being recorded and told to us by industry. We can talk about a little bit why I think that is. So we're doing better at that, according to FireEye, but it's taking a lot longer and it's costing more. So we talk about dwell time. Does everybody know what that is? And what mean time to identify? Depending on the study that you're going to look at, and on this slide, I took data from 5 different studies. Of course, FireEye, M-Trends, Verizon Data Breach. The Ponemon Institute does a study every year. It's commissioned by IBM, but I think their methodology is pretty good. And of course, there's some stuff from Carbon Black and NTT throughout the presentation. You will hear in industry a lot of numbers thrown out. So I'm just going to pause a little bit about data. Whatever study you're looking at is going to be influenced by whoever is creating it, okay? So their particular data set is going to be what's on the screen, right? That's logic. It's also going to have a spin on whatever they're trying to sell. So I say that in case you're in a situation where you're talking to the CISO, or you are the CISO and you're talking to the board or whatever, and they, challenge your data or challenge your numbers. I want you to think directionally when we're talking about analysis, and that way you can understand the caveats when people challenge whether it's like 100 days of dwell time or 179 days. Trends are what matters here, okay? So according to FireEye, is this a pointer? Oh, okay. So according to FireEye, which has a smaller data set, breaches are being identified internally more so than out. Or that should be internal versus external. So previously, only 42% were identified internal. Now I know that says third parties. That should say not third parties. And that's improving. So that's good. That means we're getting better at detecting. Though some of you may be feeling in the room, is that really true, right? Is it true? Or is it that we have to disclose more? There's a difference between causation and correlation. So as we go through these things and you think about how it relates to your own experience, I encourage you to question studies, question data, and what is actually happening here. Increase in dwell time. So this is defined as during an investigation when you have the first evidence of a compromise, the first action, to when the organization realizes it's there, either from internal sources or external sources. In the M-Trends and FireEye, Mandiant world, they use median, which is not the same as an average, and they talk about dwell time. Other organizations talk about mean time to identify, okay? So the point here is it's taking longer. Ponemon says 179 days in their data set, FireEye says 101, but both have increases from 2017. So why is that? We have these huge tech stacks that are growing, right? I think in an organization that has more than 30,000 people, or 20,000 people, it's APT, see, they don't like this. That's going to have a tech stack that's north of 200 tools. Has anybody else seen that before? A tech stack of 200 tools? Yeah, it's amazing. So what kind of complexity is in there? And yet it's taking us more time to find these things. And of course, as the time for attackers to be in your network increases, so does the cost. And we see that as a correlative factor in the average cost of a data breach. So 4% increase year over year in that. What's interesting here, you'll see numbers like $148 per record for a data breach, right? In the United States, that's global. In the United States, it's 233. When GDPR comes into play and you fail to notify in a specific period of time, that could be 4% of your revenue. That's going to make your CFO scream, or $20 million, whichever is more. These things can help you increase budget, resources, and kind of make the pitch, for you to actually perform security and get support. So that's why I spend a little bit more time on this slide. It's important to know that when you see things like this, you have to contextualize it for your specific industry and your specific country. So you may say someone that says, oh, it's 148, US is 233, financial services is 245 per record. Now, obviously, when you get to scale, right, and you get to huge breaches, mammoth breaches like Facebook and whatever, the cost average goes down lower, but we're at 350 million at this point, and who cares, right? Dollar per record. The average cost in the US on their 2,000 data points is 8 million a breach. That's 6% increase year over year. If you've ever looked at your company financials, 6% increase in revenue or anything like that, or cost is huge. So this is another thing that can resonate when you're saying, I need more resources, I need time, I need support. Okay. Lastly, we see a huge growth in ransomware becoming multi-billion-dollar business. What's even scarier than this, so 2017, 2018, the estimations for ransomware losses are between $4 and $6 billion with a B, like base, right? But something like NotPetya, which is not technically ransomware, which was destruction for a motivation, $10 billion in loss. We're going to go through some of those examples in a minute. So key points here. I know there's a lot of conversation between insider threat and external. External still dominates at nearly 3/4 of all breaches are carried out by outsiders. Of those, 62% of the outside actors are organized crime, not nation state. Now, nation state sometimes, and I predict in the future will many times, employ organized crime and crime as a service avenues, so attribution is going to get messy. But the point is, 3/4 are still outside, but that means nearly 1/4 are inside, malicious or not. Okay, and then of course they're still going after database and web servers, right? That's a third in this data set. Point of sale systems, which are applicable to financial, obviously, and then no surprise here, healthcare, finance, and professional services as top targets. I also see a huge increase in energy and ICS, which is a very big passion area of mine because it involves human life implications. So if you are into that field, keep an eye out. And there's a lot of momentum there as well, both in research and regulatory aspects. Okay, so that was a lot of data. Hope you took a picture of that slide. All right, so understanding the threat landscape. Who and what are the sources of the threats? What is the motive and objective? What is my attack surface? How are they completing their mission? And we'll go through kind of what some of the current breaches and campaigns are, and then what the trends are for later and kind of how to deal with them. Okay, all right. So how many people have seen a slide like this before? How many people have been asked to explain threat actors and motives to their teams? It's kind of a struggle sometimes, but it helps build confidence in what we're defending against from the business perspective. So these are loose categories, and you'll see, if you're in Intel or researching in the space, you'll see these categories start to blend. But I think it's helpful, again, when you're translating out to the people that we protect to identify who's attacking and why they might attack, right? So the average, we have, going from left to right, we're talking about numbers here. Obviously, there's more average Joes than state-sponsored, and they tend to have lower skill than obviously state-sponsored folks. But I want to pause here and say that this doesn't necessarily mean the destructive nature of the attack. Because you can get a script kiddie that's launching autosploit, for example, and take down something real bad, right? We've all seen those types of things. So quantity does not mean severity, and skill does not mean severity, right? At DEF CON this past month, we saw an 11-year-old hack into an election system simulation, right? And you can, I mean, how many times have you seen even an insider sort of fat finger something, do something bad, right? All right, so the average Joe is usually not malicious, they're kind of curious. They could be an insider or a third party, and they generally are trying to go for speed, convenience, or they just don't care. So when I think of this, I think of shadow IT, shadow networks, people are going around the system if they're inside just to make it easy. These are the people that sort of going to go like, thanks security, that's great, but I'm going to go ahead and just launch this app myself or throw up this little EC2 instance, and I don't care what you say. They're friends. The other folks are, next category is script kiddies. These folks are usually motivated by opportunistic means, right? They could be beginner to mid-level. Sometimes they're looking for notoriety or just curiosity. These are folks that maybe are over here or that are interested in challenges or what have you, and they want to get bragging rights. You see them on forums, they want to test their skills, but they can be quite destructive. We talked about autosploit. Has anybody seen autosploit attacks so far? Right? So what autosploit was developed with very sloppy code, but effective code. Like, so let's not get into like, was it an excellent tool or not? The point is that it's out there. So what this researcher did was combine Shodan and Metasploit. So they did scannings of any internet-facing IPs, and then did auto execution of any tools in Metasploit. Spray and pray, and then released it out into the world, right? So this happened in the last year. And if this isn't on your radar, it should be, because this is a great way to encourage patching in your organizations, right? How many people say this is not going to attack us, we don't need to patch right away, it might break, right, blah, 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 it's not exploitable in the wild. This is a great comeback to that. Lone actors, these could be malicious outsiders or insiders. They could also be outside researchers, right? Think of Chris Vickers or Vickery. Sorry, I always do that to him. My bad. Where he's scanning for unencrypted S3 objects in the cloud and wanting to disclose proper vulnerabilities. Or it could be an insider threat. How many people have heard of the Waymo versus Uber issue, right? Stole all of the IP for auto-driving cars and took it with them to Uber, got indicted, huge amount of loss there. We also have hacktivists, which can be individual folks or groups driven by political activism, idealism. Snowden is a popular example. Anonymous, I think we're all familiar with that as well, which is an organized hacktivist group. Organized crime as a service is one that most executives are pretty surprised about. So this is akin to old mafia days, even though there's a lot of tangents into actual mafia pieces here. So these are financially motivated and they operate as a business. They even have customer service departments in their rent whatever organization. So if they have ransomware, if they're renting time on a server or renting out some of their back doors, whatever, and you have a problem, they literally have a window to ask for help. That is how lucrative it is, and that is how professional these folks are. It is sophisticated, and it is only getting more sophisticated, right? So just like stealing IP for espionage purposes, the nation state, if you have a talent issue, you can just rent it. You know, and most attacks do not have to be sophisticated to get in, so why not pay someone to do it for you, right? So you're going to see a huge increase in organized crime pieces here. State-sponsored espionage, theft, political advantage. What I find interesting here from a business perspective is that how many people have heard the objection from the business? Hello. 15.
I don't know why it wasn't doing that earlier. I don't know why it's doing that now.
Help me out.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there we go. That's okay. How many people here have heard one of their customers, clients, whomever, say that I can't possibly be a target, so security is not a big deal? Oh, okay, a lot of hands on that. My favorite example to tell is DuPont. So DuPont, in the last 24 months, had a Chinese national arrested and deported for espionage in DuPont paint. Why? This person was sent in as a contractor, you know, as an architect to build out a site. The mission was to steal the formula for white paint. Now, from a consumer level, you think that's not a big deal, right? White paint, why would you do that? That represents 20 years of R&D for DuPont. White paint is actually very difficult to formulate and develop. So I find that to be an excellent example because it's just like, why would anybody do that? This was a targeted and very expensive campaign on purpose where an insider was planted by a foreign government to specifically steal this piece of IP. So I've seen cases where people steal organizational charts, right? And how businesses are structured. We tend to think about what are the golden nuggets of an organization, which we have to do and understand. But even if you feel like there's nothing really unique about the business, if you're operating well, why spend all this money on consultants to figure out how your organization should be operating when you can just steal best practices from the industry? And that's actually one of the top things that people go after, organizations go after. The other, another example here, I'm looking at Carrick, is the Shamoon attack on Saudi Central Bank, looking through a weakness through VDI, where this was specific disk wiping. So one is espionage for financial gain, the other was destruction. And those are often MOs for nation states. Okay. So on to one of major threat vectors. Layer 8 issues. So one of the most common layer 8 issue or people issue is phishing. How many people love to tackle the phishing aspect? It's always a bear. So no matter how much tech we have in place, you will always end up with a good amount of people clicking, right? Because I will always make you click on something, right? It's just a thing. 60% of incident response engagements in the NTT study were related to phishing attacks. That's a big chunk. It's important to know, but look, 60% isn't all. Okay, so 40% in their data set didn't have to have any human interaction, right? So that's still CVE-based attacks or insider or whatever. 40% of the data breaches in Verizon's 2017 involved social engineering. Okay, so this is just, oops. This top piece, is a subset of this, right? So you may hear that number, that 95% of attacks include phishing. That's not true. What the actual statistic is 95% of social engineering attacks involve phishing, okay? The point, but it's still a huge problem, right? That's why there's a whole slide to it. And most of the time they're trying to develop or deliver malware through phishing. And this is, of course, a multi-billion-dollar industry. This is a dated number, 5 billion due to phishing and email-related compromise. That's an FBI number, and it's a 5-year average. If you actually look through more data, you'll find that this is much, much higher, because you can get things like ransomware and not get delivered through phishing. Okay, some major hacks and campaigns in 2017. Again, these are sound bites that you can use to help tell your story. And given the different levels in the room, I think it's important to contextualize what's happening in the market so that you can protect against these types of things. So 3 major types of hacks we'll go over today, or breaches and compromises. Data exfiltration, which we all know, funds transfer, and disruption. So the Equifax breaches, this is really interesting when we talk about why this happened, right? So the contributors, remember I used the word contributor because there's not only one reason why things happen, but this was an unpatched known vulnerability. How many of you are involved in your vulnerability management programs? How many of you beat your heads up against the wall trying to get people to patch? There you go. All right, so most companies, when they talk about patching, they have buckets of priorities, right? So a critical vulnerability might be 7 days to patch. It's never met. Some organizations have 30 days. I've seen very sophisticated organizations have critical patches open for hundreds of days, like 600 days.
That's crazy.
Right, this is where measurement is important. In this case, this particular CVE was rated an 8.4 on the CSS scale, okay? So when we talk about ratings for vulnerabilities, that puts you in the high category. There's a scale of 1 to 10, 9 and 10 is critical, 9 to 7 is high. So usually organizations will focus on the first 2, and then they have just millions of vulnerabilities open below that. We know that exploits for these, you know, when I get objections from companies on patching, it's not critical, it's not on a critical asset, and it's not exploitable in the wild. This was true of this at this point, when you kind of bring this down on the patching list and priority. The reason why that excuse doesn't work anymore, though, is because we've had a trove of exploits leaked in various breaches. So something like Eternal Blue, something like Vault 7, all of those things are now available in the wild, which the exploit for this was, but because it hadn't caught up to different reporting mechanisms, it kind of went down in the stack as far as priority goes. And so then they got owned. And everybody can get owned, but this is one of the things that you can use when someone gives you the objection that it's not exploitable in the wild. My answer to that is, how do you know? That's what they said. So this is a great thing. It also had a separate incident for Equifax a couple months later that involved a breach of a payroll division using single-factor authentication, right? So I mean, and that's lesser known, but it could have been equally destructive. Professional services we talked about as a targeted industry. Deloitte email compromise. The attacker was in the system for 6 months. They had access to all of the emails, all of them. There's 176,000 people in Deloitte globally. Think about what that attack surface looks like. 176,000, right? What's interesting, a key point here is that Deloitte was using single factor at the time, okay? And they were also migrating to Office 365 at the time. One of the predictions I'll talk about later is that, you know, we have to balance the value of speed and security a lot, right? We have to negotiate that with our businesses. And sometimes we lose. But the value of being secure up front can many times outweigh the value of speed. And this is an instance where if you're distracted in upgrades, you're an excellent target. And this actually happens a lot, particularly when you have organizations that are trying to move to the cloud. Funds transfer. How many of you have heard about the SWIFT attacks? Yeah. So this resulted in $81 million, which actually should have been north of 100, right? But they were able to stop the attack or mid-attack because they had some decent failover processes. But $81 million transferred out of the Bank of Bangladesh in minutes. What's interesting about this is that, of course, they used phishing and unpatched systems, but this also involved a piece of weaponized hardware. Okay, like just a itty-bitty network device, not give too much attribution, that has a piece of malware on it, and it was put into the system. So when we talk about trusted devices and inventory of things, right, which is an accounting piece, the Bank of Bangladesh did not follow this. And so one of the network engineers just plugged into a device because he needed to make something work. There you go. I've also seen some significant ATM manufacturers where their online portal was selling weaponized ATM devices without their knowledge, right? So you have OEM and supply chain implications that people may not think are actual and happening. They're happening, right? Even your electronic cigarettes. A couple of years ago, the charging mechanism was weaponized, right? Let's see some head shakes. Yeah, and what happens? Because you charge it into your laptop, right? Yeah, right? It's like plugging into a port at the airport. Fantastic. Okay, so a little bit after that, we saw the same type of attack from the International Bank of Taiwan, another 60 million out, and that is still pending investigation. So what's also significant is that if you are in the financial services industry or any, and they transfer money out, there are nation states that will not allow you, they don't care. It's not like they're federally insured. They're not going to give you the money back, okay? So you have to be careful about weighing that risk. Some people say, well, we have international agreements that can get some of that back. Sometimes you don't. Disruption. There's actually a really good article that talked about NotPetya that came out a week ago. It's fascinating. And it talks about the story of a major maritime shipper in Copenhagen, Maersk. Probably butchered that. How many of you have heard about this piece of NotPetya? Oh, fantastic. So they tell the story of all of this, the screens going black and the engineers running into conference rooms and unplugging stuff and just, everything just going haywire. It's a terrible story, but it's also fascinating. $300 million in damages. Now, aside from the money, this particular company controls 20% of the world's shipping capacity. 20%. In addition to this, the same campaign also bricked a subsidiary of FedEx, which resulted in $350 million in loss. Think about what that means from a delivery and even a consumer perspective. Okay, what was interesting here is this is a third-party risk. The attackers weaponized updates for a widespread tax software called MEDoc. It was originally out of the Ukraine, but because this, and it's not like they intended to go for this, this was not the original victim, but the use of this particular software, it's like in here, like the US would be like TurboTax. Think about how widespread that is. It went all over the place. And those automatic updates delivered NotPetya through a back door. Right? So third-party risk is really important here. And understanding what to do in times like this is important. You have to get your tabletops. You have to visualize these, these scenarios and how to respond. These folks were bricked for a long time. And ICS and anybody running on dated systems or capitalized equipment, they are learning some lessons from this piece. Another disruption is, I mentioned a little bit about Saudi Central Bank, exploited a weakness in VDI. So if you have folks or organizations that travel internationally and they want to use thin clients, this is an exploit that you need to understand and a target you need to understand so that you can help them figure out how to use that safely. Here they used variants of a disk wiping malware called Shamoon and Shamoon 2, which has resurfaced in the past 18 months. Sweet Jesus.
Just wiggle the mouse pad. It keeps going to sleep. Just wiggle the mouse pad.
Just wiggle it.
Yeah.
Wiggle just a little bit. Someone doesn't like me talking about these things. All right. So, and that wiped a huge amount of critical infrastructure, and not just had implications to Saudi Bank either. So data exfiltration is sometimes what gets all the press. In fact, we saw a lot of the studies on breaches. That's usually tied to this. But it can actually cost real dollars, not just in fines and costs of the breaches, but actually transferring money out. And of course, DDoS or disruption attacks are on the rise and are something that you really have to think about in today's world. Okay, so other major hacks and breaches other than campaigns in 2017. We talked about this trove of leaked government tools, okay, through shadow brokers and Vault 7. This can help you with that conversation of it's not exploitable in the wild, right? And there are different threat models that you can use to get people to patch. WannaCry and Petya, the target there was financial gain. Of course, they were both ransomware pieces. WannaCry affected 150 countries and didn't have a lot of financial loss initially, so you saw a lot of, people say, oh, what's the difference? What did they get, like $4? So big deal. But what it did was act as a testing mechanism for this type of market to see who pays, who doesn't pay. Think of it like the first furrow in. When you have recompromise rates that go into 50 and 60% within 24 months, and you can sit back on your laurels thinking it's not a big deal, that's a scary place to be. So those are really important things to remember when people say, oh, what a big deal, right? Not Petya, we went through this a little bit. I want to go through a couple of the other companies that fell victim to this in the same time frame. So we talked about Maersk, 300 million maritime shipping, and FedEx at 300 million. Mondelez is the owner of Nabisco. $188 million snacks, right? Snacks. That's a big hit. Saint-Gobain is a French company that deals in construction, and that was $384 million loss. And then, of course, Merck Pharma at $4 million. This doesn't include, so all in all, in this, there was a White House briefing on this that quantified this at a $10 billion loss just for this campaign worldwide. This did include the hospital in Pennsylvania, the wind turbines in other areas of the country that fell victim to this. So, destruction, and this is the largest loss last year, destructive attacks. The bricking of environments, not just trying to steal your data, actually taking down your business. We also saw an increase in botnet campaigns with DriedX, which is also known as Crydex, which weaponized Word files in order to take over armies of endpoints. That was also part of phishing and spamming campaigns. We saw a lot of ATM-based attacks, both physical and network. How many people have seen the exploits at DEF CON and Black Hat where you spit out money in the ATM from across the world? Those are fun, right? But they're being commoditized. Those are the types of things that you can rent as a service, easy. And how many pen tests have we seen where you can get root from an ATM on the other side of the world? Because we're not doing so well in getting rid of flat networks, right? We also saw some interesting cases with human error and weak controls. Who here is part of the team to get to the cloud in your organization? Well, God bless you guys that aren't part of it, but it's coming. So unencrypted S3 objects on public clouds Okay, this is not just an AWS issue, although S3 is AWS, but this is more about not planning strategically on how to use this new technology. Any issues you have with hygiene on-prem will be exacerbated in the cloud. So if you're messy on-prem and you don't tighten controls and understand how the business is working and configure security up front, you're going to have a hell of a problem going forward because it is that much faster to create the problem. You don't have to rely on someone to rack and stack and run cable for you. You can just spin something up on a public-facing cloud. And here are some examples. So deep root analytics. Virtually every voter in the United States, 198 million people that have voted and ever voted in a United States campaign, your PII is out there. And not just your PII, not just your name and address, your favorite color, okay? What this particular company did was scrape all of the social media sites for your information and correlate behaviors. So how you voted, why, what influenced your vote, all of that was part of this company, and they stored this data on, I think, 4 Excel databases in publicly facing S3. And Chris got a hold of it and told the company. But that was out there for quite some time. Scottrade, a third-party example that you can arm yourself with. This was interesting because it was 25,000 records with usernames and plain text passwords. Plain text passwords. Why would your third party need plain text passwords? So that was, here we're seeing examples of risky practices combined with very easy tech to use. So if we're not tightening down controls on data and being deciduous of what we're collecting and how it's stored, and then we couple that with really easy ways to make mistakes, human error comes out at 25% of insider, or of breach issues. Of course, and then we have DoD and Booz Allen, where these are sensitive government information that you would think would be locked down more, but they are not immune to either. And in the Booz Allen NGA case, the contractor's SSH keys and login creds were also discovered, just for anybody that might know the address to this particular S3 bucket. So let's talk about some good news. All right. Threats and predictions going forward. So, that's right. Why not? Of course, right? It's good. These are opportunities where you can rush in and help. All right. I focus a lot on the basics because we can get distracted by the sexy, right? But we all know that you can get really sophisticated tech and it not work at all if you have no visibility into your network. Why would we advocate for that? Unless you are going to just use the tech in a specific area of the network that you can clean up and have it effective, we really need to start managing expectations on what this means, right? And get the basics in as part of our funding. So phishing, unpatched known vulnerabilities, hygiene weaknesses will continue to be major vectors of compromise. I'm doing a talk with FBI later on this year on the future of cyber weapons. And a big part of that talk is they're still going to do the same thing. Do not get distracted. Get your house in order. Why are they going to do something sophisticated when they can do something low cost and easy, right? This piece here, I'd like you to focus on. 2017 breaches and the resulting data troves, we have not yet seen how the breaches of Equifax and others are going to be weaponized and used. It's going to take a little bit of time to see that happen. Okay, so now we're about almost 18 months in. I think we're going to have some surprises in the next 6 to 12 utilizing the implications of those breaches. Okay, so why that's important is that you may get folks that say, oh, well, how did that really hurt the company? Their stock rebounded in a quarter, which it usually does. That's not the only implication that's going to come out of that. So, giddy up. We talked about crime as a service offerings. Those will continue to mature in sophistication. They will continue to mature from a business operations standpoint. The cost is going to go lower, and it's going to be more pervasive. So attribution, while important, is going to be more difficult, and the sophistication and ease of access. I think you'll see some of remember the threat actors to the left? They will mature over time into actors into the right because of the financial gain. This part here is also, I think, really important, targeting the strategic plan. How many of you work for public companies? Okay. How many of you know your strategic plan for your business? Every business has a strategic plan. And what that is management's voice in what the company is going to invest in and do over X period of time. Think about that. You're telegraphing to the world what advances you're going to do, which is great from an investor standpoint. It's great from a marketing standpoint. It's also wonderful information from an attacker standpoint. If I know that you're going to the cloud, and that's your goal in the next 24 months, if I know that you are condensing your IT and your portfolio, I know, and you're particularly old company or have any insight into your company, I think I'm going to understand that that's going to be a difficult thing to do. And you're going to be distracted, and there's going to be mistakes. We have this inherent issue, again, in business where we trade off speed and innovation, and how many voices in security lament about security being bolted on the back end, right? It is rarely up front. So if I know what you're doing, which is wonderfully telegraphed in these strategic plans, then I know how to attack you when you're weakest. Because you're not going to be looking at me, you're going to be looking at whatever new shiny object you're trying to build, right? And I think business owners don't understand that piece. But there are many data points, and I've given you some today, that can help you articulate that and show examples of when attackers specifically watched and waited for these times in order to carry out missions and carry them out swiftly and pretty destructively. Okay, so part of this is sloppy cloud adoption. Attackers exploiting read-write, that should say objects, on public clouds. Objections, a little Freudian slip there. Rush to mobile platforms will result in application weakness, because we still have not armed our application developers with security practices, right? It's just it's a mess. And AI and ML efforts will neglect security concerns, right? This will also impact the practice of defensible deletion. How many of you know what that is? Do you know what defensible deletion is? E-discovery. Think about all of the things that you have to protect. There is this concept of defensible deletion means that it's part of data governance. So after a while, you have all of this data, right? And you need to get rid of it in certain periods of time. So there are many companies that help with this, but the business, because they want to be able to learn from the data, will hold on to it, which means it's a larger attack surface for us to defend, right? For no need. And so this will grow. So if you think we have a data problem now, more job security for you. Okay. And then, of course, your attack surface and blindside will expand with third-party risks, and we talked about that. So what can we do about this? Where's the happiness? So avoid distraction and focus on the basics, right? 95% of the attacks, and this is quantity, not severity, can be prevented through basic hygiene practices. And we've all said this, and I'm so happy to hear this echoed in keynotes at Black Hat and DEF CON and pretty much everywhere I go, is that we are pounding on the door asking for investment in proper inventorying, in network segmentation, processes and procedures. And I would also argue that this hygiene is not just tech-based. You have to have hygiene in process and people too. If you want to actually operationalize security, it's not just about making sure, the tech is implemented correctly. It still has to be used at the end of the day. Otherwise, you're going to flood your SOC with an enormous amount of alerts, and then they won't look at them anyway, and we're in the same position. right? So you've got to think about those layer 8 implications and how to simplify process along with any tech that you're putting in the system. If you don't know, if you can't see your network, you can't defend your network, if you don't know what a trusted device is because you don't have proper inventorying, how are you going to work that out? If you're not managing your keys, your identity, and access processes, there's so many of us that when we see IAM come up, we just, right, because it's so hard. Manage the keys. And I yell about this a lot in industry, so the timer goes, because we focus on passwords a lot, right? People to system creds, but we don't look at things like SSH keys a whole bit because they're a lot of head nods. Because, you know, sometimes they're more technical to understand. Real simple way to explain that to your business is system to system creds. You throw those out there on an unencrypted S3 object, or you keep provisioning them like nobody's business. And the last metric I saw was a 12-to-1 ratio on average of unmanaged SSH keys. That's a huge attack surface, right? That we're not putting enough eyes on. And we just saw, like I said, we just saw the breach with Booz Allen that had a bunch of that out. I also had a client one day that had the opposite issue, where in many of their processes, they had millions of SSH keys. This is a 10,000 person company. Millions. However, one particular critical process only had one, and they lost it. So they had to call an admin who had recently left the company and said, do you have a copy of this? This is not a joke, this actually happened. And he said, oh yes I do, let me email that, I'll check my email. He had emailed that to himself for safekeeping through his Gmail account, which then he was able to email back to the company. Just gonna let that marinate a little bit. That's it. Please manage your keys. All right, holistic security awareness training. This is more than just phishing simulations. Remember going back to layer 8? I did a study, 40,000 point study on the correlation between compliance-based training and SIMs, phishing SIMs. If you don't deploy the capability correctly, and you set it up in a way that cannot be measured and you don't know how to measure it, you will actually put yourself in a little bit of a precarious situation and give yourself a false sense of security. In this particular study, the people that took the training clicked more than people who did not. Now, the data to the board showed a different story, showed phishing rates going down. That's an excellent story. The CISO is a pessimist. He called me and said, Anne-Marie, could this be true? I said, well, let me see. Let's look at the data. What was happening was that the sophistication of the tests were going down, so the click rates were going down. Also, how they were measuring it was improper, and we found that because the compliance training didn't have controls around it, high compliance rate, everybody took it, but it didn't require people to actually learn from it. So you saw huge pockets of people that were completing this in under 4 minutes in the same offices. What's happening there? They're reading answers, they're not actually taking the training. And so they felt like they knew how to defend against a phishing attack, but in reality they didn't, because they clicked on everything all the time. They assumed they'd be able to spot it because they took this training, but they could not. So when you employ things like this, you've got to actually contextualize the data and make sure that you're studying the effects properly. You can feel free to ask me questions on that. Security by design, we talked about why that's important. It shouldn't be just DevOps, it should be DevSecOps. Lobby for that. Hopefully it gave you some good ideas and some good stories to do that today. Default security policies for cloud platforms there are not defaulted. It took a lot of time to lobby that just in AWS. And I was in those conversations. It's if nobody's ever done that before, it's a radio set for encryption, for example. You have to click a radio set. Who does that? Right? But there are ways that you configure before you give access to accounts that encryption for certain objects or whatever you want can be done up front, and you don't have to put that burden on the individual, okay? But a lot of folks don't realize that. They just assume that it's a native and default capability within their cloud provider, and it is not. Please do not use hope as a strategy. Drop the mic on that one. I've seen a lot of companies do that. Well, people wouldn't actually use the tech that way, right? That's not true. Use data in aiding decision making. Start measuring the basics, weigh the risks of compromise with the benefit of speed. You may see a lot of studies come out that says, that being able to measure your security program is higher on the maturity level. You got to put that in up front. Or how do you know you're making the right decisions? Right? Doesn't mean you're not improving things, you just don't know if you are, and you don't know if you're making it worse either, in that sense. But please don't do that. Make sure you get answers. Be able to defend your decisions. Be able to assess your programs. Take responsibility of that. It's a hard thing to do. It's not intuitive, even though it may seem like it is. Get help to get this piece mature. Plan for the click, we talked about that, and plan for the compromise. You can put a lot of tech up front, but you need to plan for right of boom. How do you recover quick? How do you fix this? This is like the redheaded stepchild things, because it's not as sexy. You've got to know when to engage legal, HR, your C-suite, your board. Who do you call? Who's going to be in front of the camera? Who's going to call an audible? What do you do? GDPR is going to require this really fast because you have time clocks involved here. So with that, and a lot of words, I'm going to wrap up and pause for any questions. And thank you for letting me talk to you today.